afternoon, everyone. My name is Engin Isin. I'm a professor at the Open University, and I study activist citizens, of whom many you will meet and hear today, in terms of those who are active in politics. Actually, some of the things I'm going to say follow very nicely from what Emilia said in terms of, especially in the European context, how governments and corporations would rather things not change. So that really is the main theme of also today, where we're discussing change how. Now, when we use the term change, often what we think about is societal change or large-scale change. When we say that we are committed to a future that is democratic, that is sustainable, that is just, and we're working to achieve that, we have in mind a societal change, a large-scale change, which is really the way it should be. But at the same time, at the core of that change is the individual. It requires change in individual habits, how we act in the world, how we relate to one another, how we are being with others. And often we get a sense of the relationship between individual change, how we need to change the way we act, when dramatic things happen. For example, consider Edward Snowden, or even Aaron Swartz, both of whom were doing habitual, regular things in their lives, but they came at one point to a realization that they could no longer function in the way in which they regularly function, either as a FBI or CIA security agent or a university student, and they brought a considerable change in their behavior. And it took a lot of courage. One ended up actually committing suicide in face of considerable pressure that he found himself in. And we know that Edward Snowden is now in exile in Russia and with an uncertain future. There are many more examples, and you're going to hear today from other activists, where in fact, when we do act politically, the risks considerably rise in terms of the consequences. So going back to Amelia's point about corporations and governments actually don't want change, and when people act as though they are involved and they are interested in change, they face considerable resistance. And that means that to be able to act requires courage, requires commitment, requires investment, and it is not something that easy to do. One of the things that we ought to start, and a day like this actually begins to recognize, is precisely that aspect of those people who are willing to take the risk to initiate change in their lives. And without those risks and without those actions, it is impossible to imagine that societal change, the kind that we want, would actually take place. It requires protest, demonstration, petitions, a wide variety of repertoires of acting together, acting with one another to be able to bring out change. Of course, voting, organizing political parties is one of those repertoires, but it also takes the kinds of risky behavior, as I mentioned, to be able to enact that change. But often when we give examples, when we consider dramatic examples like Snowden, like Aaron Swartz, and many others, you might think that, isn't it too much to ask of ordinary people to act like action heroes, as one of the terms used in this event? Doesn't it take too much? Doesn't it ask too much of ourselves to be able to be action heroes, where many of us would rather have ordinary lives, but also still committed to democratic, sustainable and just future. One of the things that interests me is that it's not only these dramatic scenes that bring about change, but less known, lesser mediated, lesser focused events that continually bring about change. I'll give you a couple of examples that I think illustrates one of these. I don't know if you'll remember, I think it was a couple of years ago, two men kissing in a pub in Soho were asked to leave the pub because the publican thought that that was not a proper thing to do in public. And the following day, more than 100 people descended on the pub in a peaceful way and enacted a kissing protest. Now, this was, of course, on the news for one day or two, and then it was forgotten. But to me, this is really a significant act of citizenship in the sense that it doesn't have to be dramatic in the sense that requiring major risks. But it at least teaches us one lesson, that when we need to politically engage ourselves in the kind of world that we want, and the kind of world that we want from others to participate in other words, if we want to have a right to ask others to participate in a just world, we also have to earn that right by acting in our everyday lives, deserving that title, as it were. To be able to deserve that title does not necessarily require engaging something as heroic as leaking major security information, which many of us will not have the privilege to have access to, but something like that, a protest, where it is in a particular place with a particular demand and a particular expression of, no, we don't want to live in a city to begin with. We don't want to live in a neighborhood to begin with, but also we don't want to live in a world in which two men kissing are considered out of this place. No, this is not the world that we are working toward. That's against our sense of rights. It's against our sense of racism, prejudice, and so on. And there are many other examples you're going to here today. And the point that I want to make is that the distinction between, or the relationship between individual acts or how we live our lives as ordinary citizens is not unrelated to large-scale change. But the relationship between the two, or the relays between the two, are often daunting. It makes us think, how is it going to make those large-scale changes if my act is so small? And yet there are certain times and places a very small act can have incredibly wide reverberations. Let me give a couple of examples for that as well. And this is a celebrated example, you will know it, but it is good to remember it again and again. You may remember from 1989, this ages me, Tank Man in Tiananmen Square, in a celebrated image where nobody knows actually who the Tank Man was. He remains anonymous, but apparently on the morning of the People's Army in China taking over the Tiananmen Square from peaceful democratic protests, he was on the way from shopping, and he saw the People's Army's tanks lined up on the street about to overtake the Tiananmen Square. And he just basically stood in front of a tank. And there's a memorable video clip you may remember where the tank maneuvers around him, being unable to just run over this ordinary citizen who's just basically making a statement. Statement is the following: I can't tolerate injustice, although I'm an ordinary person who's just coming back from shopping. I can't tolerate what I'm seeing. So there is probably no explanation for the fact that how an ordinary person would be able to summon up that courage and stand in front of a tank without explanation, and now, of course, we know without a trace. We don't know who he was until this day, and we don't also know any background about him. Now, again, you might be thinking, Okay, you said that you're going to give an example of an ordinary citizen, but you ended up giving, again, an extraordinary example. Okay, I'll give you another one. A Pussy Riot, a all-women punk band staging an act in a church, singing a song against an authoritarian regime and exposing the relationship between that authoritarian regime in Russia and the complicity of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, on its face, it's incredibly a benign act until it was responded violently by the state. Until that moment when the state reacted violently, actually the women did not know the full extent of the risk that they were taking. It could have been easily forgotten. It could not have had any reaction at all. But it is that reaction, that time and place, made an ordinary act that otherwise perhaps would not have been known to become a global event of a large proportion, where one of the really watershed events through which we have come to know the, how the authoritarian Russian state is operating. The significance of this activist citizenship is not only in terms of what it's able to change, what it's able to activate and transmit from generation to generation, but it also lies somewhere else. That going back to, again, what Emilia said, the governments and corporations would rather nothing change, related to also to the fact that governments and corporations would rather people act routinely, every day, in an ordinary way. Because governments and corporations typically treat people as though their best behavior is the routine behavior, normal behavior, not the one that, for example, resists against injustice, resists against prejudice, resists against racism, resists against homophobia, and so on. The investment in governmental routines and constantly responding or addressing us consumers and taxpayers, things that we do in everyday life, we also get into and become creatures of habit, that these habits form our everyday behavior. That's why also it is so significant to pay attention to those who break those habits, break out of those norms, and indicate to us how and where these prejudices, racism, various forms of domination and oppression take in place where ordinary lives exist. And that is really significant thing that we learn from activist citizens. And over the course of the day, you're going to hear from dozens of them who really do in their ordinary lives quite extraordinary things and take risks. And this is really a moment to just take a step back and think about how much courage it takes and how we should really recognize their acts of citizenship in what they do as activist citizens. Thanks very much.